The patrol car's red and blue lights cut through the morning mist as it rolled down my gravel driveway, kicking up dust that hadn't been disturbed since the feed truck came through yesterday. I set down my coffee and walked out onto the wraparound porch of my ranch house, watching Deputy Martinez climb out of his cruiser with the weary expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him, a white Tesla pulled up, and out stepped Patricia Hendricks, the HOA president of the new Sunset Meadows development, clutching a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Morning, Tom," Deputy Martinez called out, tipping his hat. "Sorry to bother you this early, but we've got a complaint here that needs sorting out." Patricia marched forward in her pristine white sneakers, completely out of place on a working ranch. "Officer, this man is in direct violation of multiple HOA regulations. His property is an eyesore that's destroying our property values, and he's refused to comply with our beautification standards." I leaned against the porch railing, studying this woman who'd been making my life hell for the past 6 months. Patricia was the kind of person who ironed her jeans and probably had opinions about the correct way to fold fitted sheets. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she wore a lavender polo shirt with Sunset Meadows HOA President embroidered on the chest like a military rank. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "I've told you before, I'm not part of your HOA." "That's where you're wrong," she snapped, opening her folder with theatrical precision. "According to our master development plan, all properties within a quarter-mile radius are subject to our covenants and restrictions." Deputy Martinez looked between us, clearly wishing he was dealing with a simple bar fight instead. The morning sun climbed higher over the pastures where my horses grazed peacefully, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the main house. "My name is Tom Wheeler, and I've owned the Flying W Ranch for 15 years. It's a modest spread, 200 acres of rolling pasture in what used to be the middle of nowhere, 30 miles outside of Austin. When I bought the place after retiring from 25 years as an Army engineer, the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. And the biggest decision I had to make was whether to run cattle or horses. I chose horses, and built a small boarding operation that kept me busy without being stressful. The land came cheap because it was considered too remote for development. The previous owner was an old-timer named Pete Garrison who'd run cattle here since the 1970s. Pete was ready to retire to Florida, and I was ready to trade my cramped apartment near Fort Hood for wide-open spaces and the kind of quiet that only comes with acreage. The ranch house was solid but needed work, a 1960s brick rambler that Pete had maintained but never updated. I spent the first year replacing the roof, updating the plumbing, and building a proper barn. The property came with good fencing, a stock pond, and enough pasture to support a dozen horses comfortably. I planted oak trees along the fence line, installed automatic waterers, and built a covered arena for training. For 10 peaceful years, I ran my operation without interference. I boarded horses for city folks who wanted their animals closer to nature, gave riding lessons to kids, and bred quarter horses as a hobby. The income covered expenses with enough left over for improvements. My nearest neighbors were ranchers like myself, people who understood that sometimes tractors break down at inconvenient times, that roosters crow at dawn, and that the smell of horses is just part of country life. Then Sunset Meadows arrived. The first sign of trouble came 3 years ago when surveyors appeared on the adjacent property, a 500-acre parcel that had been in the Morrison family for generations. Old Man Morrison had died, and his city-dwelling children decided to cash out rather than maintain the family ranch. Within 6 months, the entire section was sold to Meridian Development, a Dallas-based company that specialized in luxury planned communities. The transformation was swift and jarring. Ancient oak trees that had stood for over a century disappeared overnight. Rolling pastures were scraped flat and divided into half-acre lots. The creek that had meandered naturally through the property was channeled into concrete culverts, hidden beneath perfectly manicured landscaping. Within 18 months, Sunset Meadows was born, 200 cookie-cutter houses in 6 approved floor plans, each painted in one of 4 earth-tone colors, approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I watched the construction with the detached interest of someone observing a foreign culture. The new residents were predominantly young professionals who worked in Austin and commuted 40 minutes each way for the privilege of living in a master-planned community. They jogged in matching athletic wear, drove luxury SUVs, and maintained lawns that looked like golf course greens. The first contact came 6 months after the last house was completed. A woman named Patricia Hendricks knocked on my door carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that retail workers practice in mirrors. She introduced herself as the HOA president and handed me a packet of documents thick enough to stop a bullet. "Welcome to the Sunset Meadows community," she said brightly. "We're so excited to have you as part of our neighborhood family." I looked at the paperwork without opening it. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. I'm not part of any HOA." Her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Oh, but you are. According to our master development agreement, all properties within our community boundary are automatically included in our covenants and restrictions. It's for everyone's benefit." "Really?" I handed the packet back to her. "I appreciate the offer, but no thank you. I've been here 15 years, and I'm not interested in joining any homeowners association." That's when I saw the real Patricia Hendricks for the first time. The practiced smile disappeared, replaced by the kind of cold stare, usually reserved for people who don't put their shopping carts back. "Mr. Wheeler, this isn't optional. You're already a member, whether you realize it or not. The least you could do is review our guidelines so we can bring your property up to community standards. Lady, I don't know what fantasy you're living in, but I bought this ranch fair and square, with a clear title, long before your development existed. I'm not subject to any HOA rules, and I never will be." She left that day, but I could see in her eyes that this wasn't over. Patricia Hendricks struck me as the type of person who'd never been told no in her adult life, and she wasn't about to start accepting it now. The harassment started small, the way these things always do. First came the certified letters, each one marked urgent and containing increasingly stern warnings about my non-compliance with HOA regulations. My crime? Having a gravel driveway instead of paved concrete? Keeping horses visible from the road, and maintaining structures not consistent with community aesthetic standards, meaning my barn, which had been there since before their entire neighborhood existed. Patricia had apparently appointed herself my personal compliance officer. She drove by my property every morning on her way to whatever job allowed her to afford a house in Sunset Meadows, documenting violations with the dedication of a private investigator. My mailbox was too close to the road. My fence was the wrong color. My horses created unpleasant odors that disturbed her enjoyment of her property. Each letter came with a fine: $25 for the mailbox, $50 for the fence, $100 for agricultural activities in a residential area. I threw them all in the trash, but they kept coming, and the amounts kept climbing. Then Patricia escalated to phone calls. She'd call at dinner time, her voice tight, with barely controlled frustration, explaining that my continued defiance was forcing her to take more serious action. She claimed to have consulted with lawyers who confirmed that my property was indeed subject to HOA oversight due to something called proximity incorporation. When I asked for copies of these legal opinions, she hung up. The breaking point came when she started showing up in person, not just driving by to take pictures, but actually walking onto my property to measure setbacks and document what she called environmental violations. I caught her in my barn one afternoon, taking photos of my horses' stalls with a professional camera. "Ma'am, you're trespassing," I told her calmly. She turned around with the righteous indignation of someone who'd never been challenged. "I'm conducting a compliance inspection. Mr. Wheeler, as an HOA board member, I have the authority to access all properties within our jurisdiction for the purpose of enforcing community standards. You have no authority here. This is private property, and I'm asking you to leave." Patricia pulled out her phone and started recording. "I'm documenting your hostile behavior for our records." This kind of aggressive response to legitimate oversight is exactly why we need stronger enforcement mechanisms. I walked over to my truck and pulled out the no trespassing signs I'd been meaning to install. Patricia filmed me hammering them into fence posts while providing running commentary about my intimidation tactics. She finally left when I mentioned that the next call would be to the sheriff's office, but not before promising that she'd exhaust every legal avenue to bring my property into compliance. True to her word, Patricia did exactly that. The certified letters multiplied, now coming from something called the Sunset Meadows Legal Compliance Committee. The fines reached ridiculous levels: $500 for unpermitted agricultural structures, $1,000 for commercial activities in violation of residential zoning, $1,500 for creating public nuisances through animal husbandry. She filed complaints with the county about my septic system, claiming it was contaminating groundwater despite the fact that it had been inspected and approved just 2 years earlier. She reported me to the state for operating a business without proper licenses, ignoring the fact that I was properly registered and had been paying taxes on my boarding operation for over a decade. She even called the USDA to report suspected animal welfare violations, which resulted in an unannounced inspection that found absolutely nothing wrong but cost me a day of lost income and considerable stress. Each complaint was professionally presented with supporting documentation, photos, and legal citations. Patricia had clearly done her homework, finding every possible agency that might have jurisdiction over some aspect of my operation. She was systematic, relentless, and completely convinced that she was in the right. The worst part was that some of these complaints actually gained traction. The county zoning office opened an investigation into whether my boarding operation constituted commercial use of agriculturally zoned land. The state environmental agency sent inspectors to examine my manure management practices. Each investigation ultimately cleared me of wrongdoing, but the process was expensive, time-consuming, and designed to wear me down. Patricia's strategy was clear. If she couldn't force me to comply through HOA regulations that didn't actually apply to me, she'd use legitimate government agencies to achieve the same result. She was weaponizing bureaucracy, and she was good at it. After 6 months of constant harassment, I decided it was time to fight back strategically rather than just defensively. My first call was to Jack Morrison, a property attorney in Austin who'd handled the original title work when I bought the ranch. Jack was a straight-shooting country lawyer who understood both rural property rights and the games that developers played. "Tom, I remember your place," Jack said when I explained the situation. "Clean title, no encumbrances, agricultural exemption properly filed. This HOA lady is blowing smoke." That's what I figured, but she's not backing down. She seems convinced that some kind of proximity rule makes me subject to their covenants. Jack laughed. "There's no such thing as proximity incorporation in Texas property law. You can't just declare neighboring properties subject to your HOA rules. If that were possible, every HOA in the state would be claiming jurisdiction over everything within sight. So what's my next move? Send me everything she sent you, all the letters, fines, complaints, everything. I'll draft a cease and desist letter that should shut this down. If it doesn't, we'll file a harassment lawsuit that'll cost her more than your place is worth." I gathered every piece of correspondence Patricia had sent over the past 6 months. The stack was impressive: over 40 letters, notices, and demands totaling more than $8,000 in alleged fines. Jack reviewed everything within a week and called back with interesting news. "Tom, I've got some additional ammunition for you. I pulled the original development agreement for Sunset Meadows, and there's language in there that specifically excludes pre-existing properties from HOA jurisdiction. The developer included that clause to avoid exactly this kind of problem. So Patricia definitely has no authority over my property? None whatsoever. But here's the interesting part. I also checked her background. Patricia Hendricks isn't just some overzealous homeowner. She's a real estate agent who specializes in HOA management consulting. She makes money helping developers establish and enforce community standards. This revelation changed everything. Patricia wasn't just a neighbor with control issues. She was a professional who had financial incentives to expand HOA authority. Her harassment campaign wasn't personal, it was business. "There's more," Jack continued. "I did some digging into other properties around Sunset Meadows. Turns out you're not the only one she's targeting. There are 3 other landowners in similar situations, all being hit with the same proximity incorporation claims. She's apparently trying to establish a legal precedent that would give HOAs expanded territorial control. The scope of Patricia's scheme was becoming clear. She wasn't just trying to force me into compliance. She was using my property as a test case for expanding HOA power throughout the region. If she succeeded in establishing that proximity alone could create HOA jurisdiction, it would fundamentally change property rights across Texas. Jack's cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It cited specific statutes protecting property rights, referenced case law, establishing the limits of HOA authority, and threatened criminal charges for harassment and trespassing. He also included copies of the original development agreement language excluding pre-existing properties, making it clear that Patricia's entire legal theory was baseless. But I had an additional card to play that even Jack didn't know about. During my 25 years in the Army, I'd spent the last 10 as a military police investigator, specializing in fraud cases. I knew how to build evidence files, document patterns of behavior, and present cases that prosecutors couldn't ignore. Patricia might be good at bureaucratic warfare, but she'd picked a fight with someone who understood the rules better than she did. While Jack prepared the legal response, I started building a comprehensive case file documenting Patricia's harassment campaign. I installed trail cameras around my property perimeter to catch her trespassing. I recorded every phone conversation with her consent. As Texas is a one-party consent state, I documented every false complaint she filed with government agencies, including the time and cost required to respond to each one. Most importantly, I reached out to the other property owners Jack had identified. If Patricia was running the same scam on multiple people, we needed to coordinate our response and share information. What I discovered exceeded my worst expectations. The cease and desist letter had exactly the effect I'd hoped for. It made Patricia angrier and more reckless. Instead of backing down, she doubled down on her claims and made several critical mistakes that would ultimately destroy her. Her first mistake was calling a meeting of the Sunset Meadows HOA board to discuss what she termed the Wheeler problem. She sent invitations to all residents, including a detailed presentation about my alleged violations and the urgent need for expanded enforcement authority. What she didn't realize was that one of the board members, a retired judge named Harold Pierce, had serious questions about the HOA's legal authority. Judge Pierce called me the day before the meeting. "Mr. Wheeler, I've reviewed the materials Patricia distributed, and I have concerns about the legal basis for her claims. Would you be willing to attend tomorrow's meeting to present your side?" I agreed immediately. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, a chance to confront Patricia in front of the entire community with documentation that would expose her scheme. The meeting was held in the Sunset Meadows clubhouse, a beige building that looked like it had been designed by a committee of people who were afraid of color. About 60 residents attended. Along with the 5-member HOA board, Patricia stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation that would have impressed a Fortune 500 CEO. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we face a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our community. Just outside our boundaries, we have a property owner who refuses to maintain basic standards of cleanliness, aesthetics, and neighborly cooperation." Her slides showed photos of my ranch taken with a telephoto lens, my barn, my horses, my gravel driveway, all presented as evidence of blight that was destroying property values. She had charts showing the potential impact on home prices, legal citations supporting expanded HOA authority, and a timeline for bringing non-compliant properties into the fold. "The law is clear," Patricia concluded. "Properties within our sphere of influence are subject to our covenants and restrictions. We have not only the right but the obligation to enforce community standards for the benefit of all residents." When she finished, Judge Pierce invited me to respond. I walked to the front, carrying a single folder, and faced a room full of people who'd been told I was the enemy. "Thank you for the opportunity to address these concerns," I began. "I'm Tom Wheeler, and I've lived on my ranch for 15 years. I'd like to start by correcting several misstatements in Miss Hendrick's presentation." I opened my folder and pulled out the development agreement Jack had obtained. This is the original master plan for Sunset Meadows, signed by Meridian Development, and filed with the county. Section 7. 3 specifically states that pre-existing properties, adjacent to but not within the planned development boundary, shall remain subject to existing zoning and covenant restrictions and shall not be subject to new covenants established for the planned development. You could hear a pin drop. Patricia's face went white as I continued reading the exact language that destroyed her entire legal theory. Furthermore, I said, producing another document, I have here my original property deed, recorded 15 years ago, which shows clear title with no HOA covenants or restrictions. Miss Hendricks claims that proximity creates HOA jurisdiction, but that's not how property law works in Texas or anywhere else. I looked directly at Patricia. What we have here isn't a property rights issue, it's a harassment campaign. Over the past 6 months, Miss Hendricks has filed over 40 complaints against me, demanding over $8,000 in fines for violations of rules that don't apply to my property. The room was dead silent. Several residents were taking notes, and I could see doubt creeping into faces that had been hostile moments before. I'm not opposed to good neighbors or reasonable standards, I continued, but I'm opposed to false claims, trespassing, and attempts to expand HOA authority beyond its legal boundaries. Miss Hendricks doesn't just represent a threat to my property rights, she represents a threat to everyone's property rights. Judge Pierce asked the question I'd been hoping for. Miss Hendricks, do you have any legal authority that contradicts the development agreement language, Mr. Wheeler just read? Patricia stammered something about consulting with lawyers and newer interpretations of proximity rules, but she couldn't produce any documentation. She'd been caught making claims she couldn't support in front of the entire community by someone who'd done his homework. The meeting ended with the board voting to suspend all enforcement actions against non-HOA properties pending a legal review. Patricia left the clubhouse without speaking to anyone, her crusade publicly exposed as legally baseless, but I wasn't done. Patricia had cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees, wasted hundreds of hours of my time, and subjected me to 6 months of systematic harassment. More importantly, she'd tried to establish a precedent that would threaten property rights throughout the region. It was time for consequences. The criminal complaints I filed the following week were based on months of carefully documented evidence. Patricia had trespassed on my property multiple times, filed false reports with government agencies, and engaged in a pattern of harassment that met the legal definition of criminal stalking under Texas law. The trespassing charges were the easiest to prove. My trail cameras had captured Patricia on my property at least a dozen times, often carrying professional photography equipment and measuring tools. Texas law is crystal clear about property rights. You can't enter someone else's land without permission. Regardless of what HOA position you hold, the false reporting charges were more complex but equally solid. Patricia had filed complaints with the county claiming my septic system was failing, despite having no evidence and no expertise in wastewater management. She'd reported me to the state for animal cruelty, based on nothing more than her personal opinion that horses shouldn't be visible from public roads. Each false report had triggered investigations that cost taxpayers money and wasted government resources. The harassment charges were supported by 6 months of documented contacts, phone calls, letters, personal visits, and complaints to multiple agencies. Under Texas Penal Code Section 42. C. Harassment occurs when someone engages in conduct intended to harass, annoy, or alarm another person. Patricia's campaign clearly met that standard. Detective Sarah Collins from the county sheriff's office reviewed my evidence file with the kind of attention to detail I remembered from my military police days. She was particularly interested in the pattern of false complaints and the financial impact on both me and the government agencies forced to investigate baseless claims. Mr. Wheeler, this is one of the most thoroughly documented harassment cases I've ever seen, Detective Collins said. Most people don't think to preserve evidence this systematically. 25 years as an MP teaches you a few things about building cases. I replied. The grand jury indicted Patricia on 12 counts, 6 counts of criminal trespass, 4 counts of filing false reports, and 2 counts of harassment. Each charge carried potential jail time and substantial fines. More importantly, The indictment would be a matter of public record, permanently documenting her criminal behavior. Patricia's real estate license became an additional leverage point. The Texas Real Estate Commission takes a dim view of licensed agents who engage in criminal activity, particularly when it involves property rights violations. I filed a formal complaint with supporting documentation, including copies of the criminal charges and evidence of her false claims about HOA authority. The civil lawsuit Jack filed was equally comprehensive. We sued for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, and abuse of process. The damages included legal fees, lost income from boarding operations disrupted by investigations, and punitive damages designed to deter future misconduct, but the most satisfying development was entirely organic. The Sunset Meadows community turned against Patricia with the same intensity they'd initially supported her. Residents who'd bought into her rhetoric about property values and community standards felt betrayed when they learned she'd been lying about basic legal facts. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her as president and banned her from holding any future leadership positions. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article about HOA overreach and property rights. Patricia's photo appeared alongside the headline, "HOA President Charged with Harassment in Property Rights Dispute." The article detailed her false claims about proximity incorporation and the criminal charges resulting from her harassment campaign. Social media amplified the story beyond anything I'd expected. Patricia's booking photo went viral on neighborhood forums, accompanied by warnings about HOA, overreach, and property rights abuse. Real estate agents throughout the region began using her case as an example of what not to do when dealing with neighboring properties. The prosecution moved swiftly once the case reached court. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been acting in good faith based on her understanding of HOA authority, but the documented evidence of trespassing and false reporting made that defense impossible to sustain. She pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence: 60 days in jail, 2 years probation, community service, and restitution for the costs of the investigations her false complaints had triggered. The Real Estate Commission suspended her license for 5 years and required her to complete ethics training before any possibility of reinstatement. The final chapter of the Patricia Hendricks saga played out over the following months as word spread throughout the region about the limits of HOA authority and the consequences of overreach. My case became a cautionary tale cited by property rights attorneys and featured in seminars about HOA governance. The Sunset Meadows community elected Harold Pierce as their new HOA president, and his first act was to adopt strict policies limiting enforcement actions to properties actually within the development boundaries. The HOA also paid my legal fees as part of a settlement agreement, acknowledging that Patricia had exceeded her authority and caused harm through her actions. Patricia and her husband quietly put their house on the market and moved away 6 months after her conviction. I heard through neighborhood gossip that she'd found work as a retail manager, a significant step down from her previous career in real estate management. The criminal conviction and professional sanctions had effectively ended her ability to work in property-related fields. The other property owners Patricia had targeted used my case as a template for their own legal responses. 2 filed successful lawsuits against her personally, and all received formal apologies from the HOA board. The pattern of harassment she'd established across multiple properties strengthened the criminal case and made it impossible for her to claim her actions were isolated misunderstandings. My ranch returned to its peaceful routine, with horses grazing in pastures that never should have been subject to HOA oversight. The boarding operation continued to thrive, and I even gained several new clients who'd heard about the case and appreciated my willingness to defend property rights against bureaucratic overreach. The experience taught me that sometimes the best defense against bullying is a systematic offense backed by solid documentation and legal support. Patricia had counted on me being intimidated by official-sounding letters and threats of government investigations. She hadn't counted on dealing with someone who understood how to build evidence files and work within legal systems. Most importantly, the case established clear precedent about the limits of HOA authority in our region. Property rights attorneys now cite Wheeler v. Hendricks when dealing with similar proximity incorporation claims. and HOA boards throughout Texas are more cautious about expanding their jurisdiction beyond legal boundaries. I still drive past the Sunset Meadows entrance every time I go to town. Past the perfectly manicured landscaping and identical houses painted in approved earth tones. It's a nice enough place. And the current residents seem content with their chosen lifestyle. The difference is that they no longer have a leader who believes that their lifestyle preferences should be imposed on neighboring properties through legal intimidation and harassment. Sometimes I wonder if Patricia learned anything from the experience beyond the obvious lesson about respecting property boundaries. Did she understand that her crusade wasn't really about community standards but about control? Did she recognize that her professional expertise in HOA management had blinded her to basic legal and ethical boundaries? Probably not. People like Patricia rarely engage in that kind of self-reflection. They move on to new communities where they can rebuild their authority and find new targets for their need to control others. But at least now there's a legal record of what happens when that control extends beyond its proper boundaries. The Flying W Ranch remains what it's always been, a working operation where horses live healthy lives and people learn to ride in safety and peace. The only difference is that now it's also a symbol of what happens when property owners stand up to harassment and defend their rights through proper legal channels. In the end, that might be Patricia's most lasting contribution to our community, not the harassment and legal threats she visited on peaceful property owners, but the clear demonstration that bullying has consequences and that property rights still mean something in Texas.